So I am delighted to be here with someone that I originally met on social media, but who I can honestly say has become a personal friend of mine, Mark Schaefer. Some of you may know him as Mark W. Schaefer on Twitter, as I first met him, or you may read his fantastic blog. I am a religious subscriber. It's called Grow, Grow. And Mark, besides being a well-known social media influencer, is also the author now of at least 2 books that I know of, The Tao of Twitter, and his new book, Return on Influence. We're going to be spending most of our time today talking about that new book, but this is the first of 2 video blog posts that we'll be sharing with Mark. The first will appear on my own firm's blog, B2B Bliss, and part 2 will be on the well-known and beloved PR Breakfast Club. So, welcome to part 1, and welcome to you, Mark. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Elizabeth.
So I before we get to Return on Influence, which is a really interesting book and of course a very timely one, I want to ask one question about the Tao of Twitter. You have a quote in there which I just loved, and I've repeated it to a few people, but you say, even if you are playing a business role on Twitter, there is no reason you can't be yourself unless you are a mean and naturally sucky person. I really love that quote because it does kind of summarize why it matters. You know, it is good to be a good person. Now that being said, though, I reflected a bit about the fact it's actually hard to be genuine online. You sometimes draw lines that you wouldn't draw, you know, if you were sitting across from a friend in a, cafe. There is a desire, I think, sometimes to compartmentalize, who am I on Facebook versus who I am on Twitter, and to sort of only show 2 dimensions. So do you think that's true? Do you think that we all sort of want to just edit to show the best version of ourselves? Is being yourself really possible on social media?
Well, believe me, I edit myself prolifically. Nobody wants to see the real me. But the reason I have that in there, and the reason I emphasize this, is because I get this question all the time about, well, do I need 2 Twitter accounts? And how do I draw the line between personal and professional? And what I try to emphasize is you can't really do that. You shouldn't really do that. And I mean, if you go to a networking meeting at the Chamber of Commerce or at the PRSA or something like that, you're not going to be an idiot, right? You're not going to break down and cry in the middle of the meeting or something like that. But how do you build relationships? It might be you might find a spark with someone over sports or over a shared hobby or a love of music or something you did with your children, okay? So that's the way we build human relationships in real life. And that's how we should do it on the internet as well. That's how relationships bloom. And that's how business gets done. We do business with the people that we like, that we trust, and that's who we seek out. And so the way that Twitter and social media, I think, is perfect for this is that through our comments, through our content, it provides these small provocations that make people interested in us. Just like in real life. Oh boy, that's that person I met last month at that meeting. She had the interesting hobby or whatever. Or, she shared that interesting link on Twitter. So that's what I really encourage people to do is to be themselves just like they would be in a real live setting. We tend to have this digital divide when we see those little avatars, and we forget that behind each one of those little pictures is an amazing, interesting, wonderful person. And we need to think about that. We need to treat people like that and be human ourselves.
Yeah, it's funny. I think that's also why I don't believe that the avatars where people use something other than a picture of themselves are necessarily that effective. They look cool, they can look creative, but I think ultimately they distance you from remembering that it is a person out there.
Well, that's right. I rail against that. I mean, there are some exceptions. There are times when you need to do something else. But I mean, it's hard to build an emotional connection with a logo or a picture of a building.
Right.
And that's what this is all about. It's about building connections. It's about building relationships. It's not, social web isn't B2B or B2C, it's P2P, it's person to person. And if you're trying to, tweet or blog behind some logo, that's a barrier.
Yeah, I agree. Well, so let's talk a bit about your really excellent new book, Return on Influence. I'm a big fan of teaching wherever you can by telling stories, and I think that's one of the things that you do very, very well in the book. And I would love it if you would retell my favorite story from the book. You talk a little bit, I think you originally got it from Malcolm Gladwell, but you talk about this notion of Paul Revere and another very little known revolutionary named William Dawes. And you talk a little bit about why is it that we all remember Paul Revere and nobody knows who William Dawes was?
Yeah. Well, it is fascinating, and I think it's such a great story for today. Because back then, in the mid 1700s, Boston arguably was the media capital of the world. It was probably the most well-educated city on earth. Okay, so this was a tuned-in city, and yet the only media that they would normally get in a day might be a newspaper, okay, some sort of bulletin, flyer, or newspaper. So getting a knock at the door was still something that shook them up. And the story that I was talking about in the book is I tried to build this story about the importance of these super connectors, of people who are the word of mouth influencers. And what's not known to many people is that two people took off in opposite directions that night. And Paul Revere is the only one remembered because he had an impact, all right? He was a great communicator. He was a super connector. And when he knocked on your door, he forced you into action. William Dawes went the other direction and nothing happened, all right? He couldn't create action. He couldn't have influence. So the idea is, even in the business world, we've always known about these people. But as we've become mass marketers, and now we have national or international clients, how do we find those people? How do we find those super connectors? How do we find those people who are amazing communicators and make things happen? And now, through the social web, we do have some tools that we can start to see who can ignite content, who is creating buzz on the web. So that's very significant because influence has been democratized in a way. And for the first time, we're able to begin to quantify the ability for people to move content, create buzz on a mass scale. And that's very, very important for businesses, marketing, PR professionals to understand.
So poor William Dawes would have been successful if he just had some better tools.
Well, he should have read my book.
Well, hindsight, or is it foresight, is 2020, I guess. Well, so let's talk a little bit about influence in a more conceptual manner. As you just alluded to, it is a critical part of almost anyone, if you're in marketing, part of your toolkit. You have to figure out, can you take advantage of influence? Can you find those super connectors that you referred to? And it seems to me that a big element of influence these days is this concept of authority. Talk to me a little bit about what do we mean when we say authority, and how is that connected to how a marketer might be able to leverage influence for their clients?
Well, authority is really important in the real world and in the online world as well. And as I wrote the book, the first half of the book, I look at some of these traditional methods of influence. How do we acquire influence and power in the real world? How does that show up in the online world? And it's vastly different because in the real world, we may get authority from an organizational chart. We may get authority from a title.
Right.
We may get authority because we've got your college diplomas and patents and awards hanging in your office. You don't have that in the online world. So it was very fascinating to me to explore this idea of how do people get authority? How do they get power in a world with no org charts, no bosses, no titles? In fact, if you've ever tried to tell somebody what to do on the internet, you'll know that doesn't work. So, but obviously people do become very powerful on the internet. And I think two concepts I'd like to mention quickly is one is this idea of social proof. Social proof in the offline world is when we don't have the facts, when we don't know the truth of what to do. We look around our environment and we try to look for clues, like who seems to be in charge here, what kind of car does this person drive, how expensive is the suit that they're wearing, and we can try to make clues by get these clues from what we observe. In the online world, we can't really talk to other people, and there's this information density, and people are starved for these clues, like Facebook likes, number of Twitter followers, even your clout score. And one of the conclusions I make in the book is quite uncomfortable to talk about and quite uncomfortable to even think about, is that I believe, at least in the short term, social proof on the internet is more important than what you actually do, because people don't dig.
Yeah.
I mean, I guarantee you, Elizabeth, when I stand up and give a speech, more people know how many Twitter followers I have than what I'm doing in my career or that I teach at a university. So they're forming their opinions about these on these clues. Now, in the long term, I think true authority, true expertise, people that are really authentic and genuine in what they know, I think that will win out in the long term. I think people on the web over time are going to be able to sniff out fakes, and true authority will win out, and it'll make a difference on the web as well.
Would you make a prediction about how long that would take?
I don't know. That's hard. Because I'm surprised, quite frankly, how some people can buffalo hundreds of thousands of people on the web every day, and they've lasted this long.
I'm forced to agree with you there. So therefore, I guess I have to let you off the hook in terms of a prediction. But I think you're right. There's very much a short, a medium, and a long-term role that influence will play.
Yes.
Well, so let's talk about another aspect of influence that I'm particularly interested in. As you know, we represent a lot of different kinds of B2B firms, and one of the things that we've certainly talked about with our clients over the years when it comes to influence is likability. Now, is likability really possible if you are a business, you're a brand that's trying to interact on the social web?
Yeah, well, my friend Dave Kirpitz built a whole career about that. The guy from Likeable Media, he wrote this Likeable, social media book. And, I think likability is important. I think there's a lot of psychological research to back that up, too, that people are usually drawn to people who are, uplifting and optimistic and likable. And I think that comes through on the web, too. I mean, one of the stories I've been thinking about doing for my blog is I used to travel to Pittsburgh on business almost every week, and I stayed at this hotel downtown, and there was a waiter there that had waited on me for breakfast for years. And this guy was so upbeat and so positive and so happy, he made everyone around him better. People wanted to sit in his section just because he was so nice. I mean, the guy, he didn't have a degree from Oxford. He wasn't a particularly, good-looking person. He didn't have any authority to speak of. But I mean, he had this just magnetism based completely on his smile, completely on his attitude. That trumps a lot. And I think that is very well appreciated on the social web too. And, you had talked about that funny quote from the book. And the thing that's always remarkable to me is you hear these statistics about, well, 80% of human communication is nonverbal. It's gestures and maybe your tone and your body language. And we don't see any of that through a tweet. Right. We don't see any of that through a blog post. So it's amazing to me that theoretically 80% of the communication is missing, and it's still so easy to sniff out a fake on the web. People who are generally good and generally likable, that comes through even when you are missing their smile.
That's true, though I'd argue the converse is also true. It's easier to sniff out a fake, but it's harder to find, I don't know, what do you want to call it, true peers, friends. There are certainly lots of people that I feel personally connected to in terms of getting their information. There's still a much smaller group of people that I would want to kind of migrate that relationship. And I think some of that is because of what you just said. With all those verbal and body cues missing, it's harder to extrapolate and say, hey, based on these 20 tweets or 50 Facebook posts, I know this person and I would sync. Yeah. But maybe that's just the nature of the beast.
And I think part of it also is, you and I have been in this for some time now. You start to get to a saturation point.
Yes, true.
At least I'm finding that.
Yeah.
Where, and it's sad in a way.
Yeah.
Where, many of the people that I really connected with years ago, like you, Ginny Dietrich, Amy Howe, let's say, Jay Bear, Mitch Joel, and we've kind of formed these bonds that started with some tweets, started with a blog post maybe, and then over time, you and I had a phone call, we got to meet face to face, and those relationships build till we can really call each other friends. And so now, how much time, how much bandwidth do you have to keep doing that over and over again? And it's frustrating in a way because I see many people that are new to the web that are making an authentic attempt to connect with me, and I love that. But it's difficult to keep up that same level that I have with you and others that started years ago.
Right. It's a little heartbreaking. I guess the opportunity then becomes, what can we do to migrate the relationships that we have already, let's say with an existing client, a friend, whomever it might be, to socialize that relationship, right? To see if you could add, I guess, a dimension with the folks that you already are naturally connected to. But that's not the same as making new connections, which is a really powerful part of the process.
Yeah, and I am making new connections for sure. But it's not at the same rate, I think, that happened, probably a few years ago. And that's part of the irony of the social web, is that the more successfully you engage, the less successfully you can engage.
Yeah. Yes. Well said.
Yeah. If you do a good job and you really, you put yourself out there and help people, which I love to do. I do it in some measure every single day.
You're very good at it.
Your ability to continue to sustain that is impossible, when you go from 10,000 Twitter followers to 50,000 Twitter followers and 500 blog readers to 50,000 blog readers. So, but I'm hanging in there, and I think people would still say I make an attempt to engage with people and connect with people, but it is, I always hate it when I think about things slipping through the cracks, and that I might disappoint somebody, but that's just the way it is these days.
Yeah. Well, this brings me to my last question for part one of our video post. You speak a fair amount in your blog and in the new book about content, and that's a subject that's very near and dear to my heart. I've told a story a few times in recent conversations and speeches of an epiphany that I had around content a few years ago, when I realized, instead of writing a typical bio to introduce a client's new blog to the world, I decided to create a song. And I hired a songwriter, and we shot a really fun video, and that's his bio, is this crazy fun song.
That's fantastic.
And it brings a smile to my face to this day, and it's because content in its purest form has the power to do so much more than really you could do in marketing before. So I want to just close with asking you a little bit about that. You talk about content as the seventh weapon of influence. Mm-hmm. What do you mean when you say we create content, but in a way content is also creating us?
I'm glad you focused on that. Because I think that is one of the most profound things in the book. And I think you're the first person that really picked up on that. And it means a lot to me, because you and I would not be having this conversation if we didn't have content at the beginning that provided that spark. Yeah. And even though you and I don't speak every day, every week, or even every month, my content and your content is like a constant little drip, drip, drip to say, I'm here, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm interested in. It creates these provocations that create the relationship, sustain the relationship, and at some point even build loyalty and friendships. And so, when you think about what's happened to me and my life and how, my career has taken an amazing new direction and all these doors have been opened up, it's because of content. Content has created who I am right now. And our ability to create content that's shared and create some reaction does create, to some extent, our ability to have power and influence in the online world. And I think one of the things that you said I thought was lovely when you're telling the story about the song, because one of the things I write about in the book is the importance of creating content that is right, R-I-T-E, relevant, interesting, timely, and entertaining. Mm-hmm. And I think as we go forward in this information-dense world, the biggest challenge and the biggest opportunity is entertaining. Mm-hmm. Because historically, we don't sit around our companies thinking, how can we be more entertaining today? And yet, if you think about the content that ignites, the content that you love to share, chances are it's entertaining. And I love that story about doing the song, because you cut through. You thought of something that was different, compelling, interesting, and entertaining, and that's something that can ignite. That's something that can cut through. And I think that's an example of a best practice, really. And I think as we look into the future, there's going to be more and more emphasis on that type of thing. So thanks for bringing that up. Thanks for finding that quote in the book, because I really, I like, in fact, I think I'll write a blog post about that, because I love that. I love that idea, and I wish more people would bring that up in discussion.
Yeah, that's a worthy topic for another day. Well, we will look for that blog post. And in the meantime, I will look forward to sharing part 2 of our video chat on PR Breakfast Club. In the meantime, I thank you so much for your time, my friend, and we'll be speaking with you again soon.
Thank you, Elizabeth.